Sometimes the most dangerous mistake isn't what you do, it's who you do it to. The rain fell steady over Highway 47, turning the asphalt into a mirror of flashing red and blue lights as Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his cruiser with the kind of confidence that came from years of never being questioned, his boots hitting the wet pavement with purpose, his eyes already locked on the black sedan, pulled over ahead like he had decided the story before it even began. Inside the car, Ava Carter sat still, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, her breathing slow, controlled, as if the storm outside had nothing to do with her, the hum of distant thunder blending with the faint static in her earpiece. A detail no one else could see, not even as Daniel approached her window and knocked twice, sharp and impatient. "License and registration," he said, his tone already edged with judgment. Ava turned her head slightly, her expression composed, unreadable, as she reached for her bag without a word. But something about her stillness lingered in the air, something that didn't match the tension building around them. Daniel noticed it, just for a second, a flicker of hesitation, but it passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the certainty he trusted more than anything else. Outside, a car slowed. Someone inside lifting a phone, recording, the soft glow of the screen reflecting off the rain. Ava handed over her documents, her voice quiet, steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" And for a brief moment, the question hung there, simple, reasonable. But Daniel didn't answer it. Not really, because in his mind the answer had already been decided long before he stepped out of his vehicle. "Step out of the car," he said instead, his voice firmer now, louder, carrying into the night as another set of headlights passed by. Ava didn't argue, didn't resist. She opened the door slowly and stepped out into the rain, her shoes touching the wet pavement with quiet precision. And when she stood upright, facing him, there was something in her eyes, something calm, almost knowing, that didn't belong in a moment like this. Daniel gestured toward the hood of the car, speaking again, filling the silence with authority. But Ava's gaze didn't shift, not even as the rain traced lines down her face, not even as the distant rumble of engines began to grow somewhere far behind them. Subtle, almost unnoticeable, she simply looked at him and said, softly, almost like a warning wrapped in patience, "You're making a decision you won't be able to take back." And for the first time that night, the storm didn't feel like the only thing building in the distance. Daniel Brooks did not respond to her warning right away, but something in the way she said it lingered longer than it should have, like a quiet echo that refused to fade. And for a split second he felt it, that subtle shift in the air, the kind that does not come with sound but with instinct. Yet he pushed it down, replacing it with the familiar certainty he had relied on for years, the certainty that had never failed him before. "Hands where I can see them," he said, louder now, his voice cutting through the rain as more cars slowed in the distance, their headlights turning the roadside into a stage. Ava complied without hesitation, her movements controlled, deliberate, almost measured, as if every second mattered in a way he could not understand. The rain continued to fall, steady and unbothered, tracing along the edges of her coat, while her eyes remained fixed on him, not defiant, not afraid, just present. And that presence unsettled him more than resistance ever could. Because resistance he understood, resistance he could control. But this quiet stillness, this lack of reaction, it created a space where doubt could exist. And Daniel Brooks was not a man who tolerated doubt. His radio crackled suddenly, a burst of static interrupting the moment. He reached for it instinctively, pressing the button. "Dispatch, confirm status." But the response that came back was distorted, fragmented, like a signal struggling to hold itself together. He frowned, tapping the device once, then again, the sound cutting in and out. And for the first time that night his focus shifted away from Ava, just slightly, just enough for her to exhale slowly, almost imperceptibly, her fingers brushing lightly against the side of her watch, a small movement hidden beneath the rhythm of the rain. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a gesture that could easily be missed by anyone not looking for it. Somewhere far beyond the highway, miles away, a system awakened, silent screens flickering to life, lines of code streaming across monitors, operators leaning forward as alerts began to populate one after another. Back on the roadside, Daniel straightened, irritation replacing his earlier confidence. Do not move, he said, his tone sharper now, but it lacked the same edge it had before, because something had changed, even if he could not yet name it. The sound of engines grew louder in the distance, not passing traffic this time, but something more coordinated, more deliberate. Ava heard it before he did, her gaze shifting ever so slightly toward the dark stretch of road behind him, where faint headlights began to multiply, cutting through the rain in perfect alignment. Daniel turned, just enough to notice, his posture tightening as the realization crept in, slow and unwelcome, that this stop, this routine moment he had controlled so many times before, was no longer entirely his, and standing there in the rain, with the weight of something unseen closing in, he began to understand that the decision he had made just minutes ago was no longer a simple one, and whatever came next was already in motion. The headlights did not pass. They approached, steady and synchronized, cutting through the rain like a decision already made long before this moment. And Daniel Brooks felt it before he understood it. That quiet pressure building in his chest, the kind that does not come from fear, but from uncertainty, the kind he had spent his entire career avoiding. He squared his shoulders, trying to regain control of the scene, trying to anchor himself in the authority he knew so well. Stay right there, he repeated, but his voice no longer carried the same weight. Not with the growing hum of engines filling the air, not with the reflection of multiple vehicles now stretching across the wet pavement behind him. Ava Carter did not move. She did not speak. She simply stood there, rain falling around her, her posture unchanged, her expression calm in a way that no longer felt ordinary. It felt intentional, like she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Daniel turned fully now, his eyes narrowing as the first black vehicle came into clear view, then a second, then a third, each one identical, each one stopping with precise spacing, doors remaining closed for just a second too long, long enough to make the silence heavier than the storm itself. The bystanders who had been recording shifted uneasily, their whispers fading as the energy of the scene changed, because this was no longer a routine stop. This was something else entirely, something bigger than anyone standing on that roadside had expected. Daniel's radio hissed again, then went completely silent, and that was the moment it clicked, not fully, not yet, but enough to break the illusion he had been holding on to. He was not the center of this situation anymore. He had stepped into something already in motion, something structured, controlled, and far beyond his reach. The doors of the lead vehicle opened slowly, not rushed, not aggressive, just deliberate, as if whoever stepped out already knew the outcome before their feet touched the ground. Polished shoes met wet asphalt, followed by another, then another, figures moving with quiet coordination, their presence commanding without a single raised voice. Daniel felt his grip on the moment slipping, his thoughts racing to catch up, to make sense of what he was seeing. But the pieces did not fit the narrative he had built just minutes ago. Behind him, Ava finally shifted her gaze, not toward Daniel, but toward the arriving figures, and for the first time, there was something new in her expression, not relief, not satisfaction, but recognition, like a signal received and acknowledged. One of the approaching men spoke into a device clipped to his collar, his voice low but clear, confirm visual, and another voice answered through a channel Daniel could not hear, precise, controlled, official. The rain continued to fall, but now it felt distant, like background noise to something far more significant unfolding in real time. Daniel took a step back without realizing it, his instincts telling him to reassess, to recalibrate. But there was no time for that anymore, because whatever authority he thought he held in this moment was already being rewritten, and as the figures closed the distance between them, one thing became undeniable. This was never just about a traffic stop, and he was no longer the one in control of how it would end. The man who stepped forward did not rush, did not raise his voice, and did not need to, because everything about his presence carried a weight that silenced the storm itself. His coat unmoved by the wind, his posture precise, his eyes fixed not on the scene but on Ava Carter, as if confirming something only he could see. Daniel Brooks instinctively straightened, his training pushing him to reassert control, to ask questions, to demand identification, but the words did not come out the way they usually did, not as sharp, not as certain. "This is an active stop," he said, his voice tighter than before. "I need you to step back." But the man did not step back. Instead, he reached calmly into his coat and revealed a badge. Not flashed, not forced into attention, just held steady in a way that made it impossible to ignore, the kind of authority that did not ask to be recognized. It simply was. The rain traced along the edges of the badge, catching the faint glow of the cruiser lights, and for a brief moment Daniel stared at it, trying to process what he was seeing, the letters, the seal, the weight behind it. None of it aligned with the situation he thought he was in. Behind the man, the others had formed a quiet perimeter, not aggressive, not chaotic, just positioned with intent, every movement controlled, every step calculated. Ava remained where she was, her hands still visible, her posture unchanged. But now the distance between her and the arriving group felt smaller than the distance between her and Daniel. The man finally spoke, his voice low, measured. "Officer, you are going to take a step back." It was not a suggestion, not a negotiation, just a statement placed into the air with certainty. Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any argument could have, because it was the first crack in the authority he had been holding on to. "I need clarification," Daniel replied, trying to regain ground. But even as he said it, the words felt weaker, like they belonged to a version of the moment that had already passed. The man's gaze did not shift. "You will have it," he said, "but not before you release control of this situation." And that was when the silence deepened again, not empty, but full of something Daniel could not define but could know. Longer ignore. Ava's eyes met his once more, and there was no anger there, no fear, just a quiet certainty, the kind that comes from knowing exactly how something will end. Somewhere behind them, another vehicle door closed softly, a subtle sound that carried more finality than any command. Daniel exhaled, slow, controlled, but inside, everything was shifting, because this was no longer about a routine decision. It was about understanding a reality that had already moved beyond him. And as the man took one final step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal, direct, he said, "You are standing in the middle of a federal operation." And for the first time that night, Daniel Brooks realized that whatever he thought he was enforcing was no longer the law that mattered. Daniel Brooks felt the words settle over him like a weight he could not shake. A federal operation. The phrase echoed louder than the rain, louder than the fading hum of passing cars. And for a moment he stood there trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed just minutes ago, his grip on certainty slipping further with each passing second. "That is not possible," he said. But even to his own ears the words sounded thin, like they lacked the authority he had relied on for so long. The man in front of him did not react to the denial, did not challenge it. He simply turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the others behind him. And in that small movement something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because now the entire scene was no longer centered on Daniel. It had moved past him, around him, beyond him. Ava Carter finally lowered her hands slowly, not in defiance, not in relief, but with the quiet composure of someone stepping back into a role that had never truly left her. The rain continued to fall, but now it felt distant, like the background of a moment far more controlled than it appeared. Daniel watched as one of the agents approached Ava, not hurried, not tense, just precise, offering a small nod of recognition that carried more respect than any words could have. "Ma'am," the agent said, his tone firm but measured, and that single word landed harder than anything else that had been spoken that night, because it confirmed what Daniel had been resisting, what he had refused to see. Ava was not just part of this situation, she was above it, at the center of it, and everything that had unfolded was now being reframed in real time. Daniel took a step back without realizing it, his mind racing to catch up, to find a place where his authority still existed. But every path he reached for dissolved the moment he tried to hold onto it. "I was conducting a lawful stop," he said, the words coming out slower now, more careful, as if choosing them correctly could somehow restore the balance he had lost. The man with the badge looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with judgment, but with something far more unsettling, understanding. "And now you are standing in a situation that requires you to listen," he replied, calm, direct, leaving no space for argument. Ava turned her gaze back to Daniel, and for the first time there was something else there. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that comes when the truth no longer needs to be hidden. "Officer," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm, "you did not stop a threat tonight." She paused, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. "You interrupted one." And that was when the final piece shifted into place. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through realization, because standing there on the side of that rain-soaked highway, surrounded by a system that had already moved far beyond him, Daniel Brooks understood something he had never faced before. This was not about control anymore. This was about consequence. And whatever came next had already been set into motion long before he ever turned on those lights. The rain had not stopped, but everything else had. The movement, the noise, even the sense of urgency that had filled the air just minutes ago, replaced now by a quiet, controlled stillness that belonged to a different kind of power. Ava Carter stood centered within it, no longer a subject of the moment, but its anchor, her presence steady as the agents around her shifted positions with quiet precision, each movement deliberate. Each step part of a structure Daniel Brooks could now only observe, not influence. He remained where he was, but the space around him had changed. It no longer felt like his scene, his stop, his decision. It felt like he had stepped into something already defined, something that did not require his input to continue unfolding. One of the agents stepped closer to Ava, holding a secure tablet angled just enough for her to see, lines of information reflecting faintly in the rain. She glanced at it briefly, her expression unchanged, then gave a small nod, a silent confirmation that carried more authority than any spoken command. "Proceed," she said, her voice calm, measured, and in that single word the entire dynamic shifted again, because it was not a request, it was direction, immediate and unquestioned. Daniel felt it, that invisible line being drawn, not in front of him, but around him, placing him outside of the decision-making, outside of the control he had assumed was his. "I need to understand what is happening," he said, but the statement came out different now, no longer a demand, more like an attempt to catch up to a reality already moving past him. The man with the badge turned slightly, acknowledging him without urgency. "You will receive a full report," he replied. "But right now your role is to step back." The words were not harsh, but they carried finality. The kind that does not invite negotiation. Daniel swallowed, his eyes shifting from the agents to Ava, searching for something, an explanation, a sign that this could still be reinterpreted, but all he found was clarity. She was no longer reacting to him. She was operating within something far larger, something he had interrupted without understanding. The distant glow of the vehicles reflected across the highway, their engines idling in quiet synchronization, and somewhere beyond the visible scene, unseen systems continued to move, decisions being made, actions unfolding in places far removed from this stretch of road. Ava stepped forward slightly, not toward Daniel, but toward the lead agent, her voice low enough that only those closest could hear, yet steady enough to carry authority. "Contain the exposure," she said, and the phrase itself revealed the scale of what was happening. This was not about a single moment, a single stop. This was part of something ongoing, something structured, something sensitive enough to require precision even in interruption. The agent nodded immediately, turning to relay the instruction without hesitation. Daniel felt the weight of it settle in, the realization that he had not just made a mistake, but had stepped into a chain of events already in motion, and now those events were adjusting around him, not because of him, but in spite of him. He took another step back, this time aware of it, aware that the control he once held had fully transitioned to something else, something quieter, more precise, and far beyond his reach. And as the rain continued to fall, steady and indifferent, Daniel Brooks understood that this moment was no longer about what he had done, but about what had already begun, long before he ever arrived, and what would continue long after he was no longer part of it. The highway no longer felt like a place where things happened by chance. It felt controlled, observed, almost curated, as if every second now belonged to something larger than the people standing within it. Ava Carter remained at the center of that stillness, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that made everything else feel temporary. One of the agents moved closer, handing her a secure device, its screen glowing faintly through the rain. She took it without hesitation, her eyes scanning the information quickly, efficiently, as if she had already anticipated what she would see. Daniel Brooks watched from a few steps back, his hands now empty, his stance no longer firm but uncertain, like someone standing in a space that had shifted beneath him without warning. The sound of passing traffic had faded, replaced by the low hum of idling engines and the quiet exchange of controlled voices, each one brief, precise, never louder than necessary. "Channel secured," one agent said softly. Another responded almost immediately. "External access contained," and though Daniel could not fully understand the language, he could feel its meaning. This was coordination at a level he had never been part of. Ava lifted her gaze from the device, her expression unchanged, but there was a sharpness there now, a focus that suggested she was no longer reacting to the situation but directing it. "Status on the breach?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying weight. The agent beside her responded without hesitation. "Attempt isolated, but we are tracking multiple entry points." Ava nodded. Once, a small movement that triggered immediate response from those around her, commands relayed, positions adjusted, systems monitored, everything moving forward with quiet urgency that did not need to be seen to be understood. Daniel shifted slightly, his mind struggling to catch up, to place himself somewhere within what was happening, but every attempt left him further outside of it. He glanced down at his radio again, still silent, still disconnected, a small detail that now felt symbolic of something much larger. He was no longer connected to the system he thought he understood, and whatever system this was, it had no need for him. Ava turned slightly, her eyes scanning the horizon for a brief moment, not searching, just confirming, as if every element of the environment had already been accounted for. Then she spoke again, quieter this time, but no less precise. "We do not escalate unless necessary." And the instruction carried a deeper meaning: restraint, control, discipline. Not the kind that reacts, but the kind that anticipates, the kind that prevents. One of the agents acknowledged immediately, stepping back to relay the directive. Daniel felt the shift again, not outward this time, but inward, a realization forming slowly, that this was not about a mistake he could correct or explain away. This was about a line he had crossed without knowing it existed, a boundary between visible authority and something far more complex, far more structured, and far more powerful. Ava's gaze moved back toward him briefly, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a quiet awareness, as if she understood exactly where he stood in this moment, not as a threat, not as an ally, but as someone who had stepped into a reality he was never meant to see. And as the rain continued to fall over the highway, steady and indifferent, Daniel Brooks realized that what was unfolding around him was not just an operation. It was a system of control operating on a level he had never imagined, and he had just interrupted it at the worst possible moment. The air felt tighter now, not because of what could be seen, but because of what could not. Invisible layers of control weaving through the scene as Ava Carter stood quietly at the center, her attention fixed on the data streaming across the device in her hand, her eyes moving with precision, absorbing, calculating, deciding, while around her the agents adjusted their positions with subtle coordination. No wasted movement, no unnecessary words, just a system responding to her presence like it had been designed to do. Daniel Brooks remained still, but inside everything was shifting, the weight of what he had interrupted settling deeper with each passing second. He watched as one of the agents spoke again, his voice low but urgent. "We are seeing activity rerouting. They know we are here." And that sentence alone changed the gravity of the moment, because this was not just an operation, it was a live situation. Something active, something reacting. Ava did not flinch, did not rush. She simply lifted her gaze slightly, her mind already moving ahead of the problem. "Then we stay ahead of them," she replied, calm, controlled, the kind of response that did not react to pressure but redirected it. Another agent stepped closer, pointing at the screen, multiple nodes attempting access from different regions. Ava nodded. Once, her expression sharpening just enough to signal the shift from observation to command. "Isolate the pattern. Do not chase the noise," she said, her voice steady, each word deliberate, and immediately the agents responded, relaying instructions, adjusting their focus, narrowing their targets. Daniel could hear it now. The language of something far beyond patrol protocols, far beyond traffic stops. This was strategy, layered, precise, and unfolding in real time. The rain continued to fall, but it no longer felt like part of the scene. It felt distant, like everything else that had once grounded him. He looked down at his hands, empty, then back up at Ava, and for the first time he saw her not as someone he had stopped, but as someone operating on a level he had never even considered, someone who did not need to raise her voice to be heard, because everything around her was already listening. A sudden flicker crossed one of the agent's devices, a shift in data, and the tension tightened again. They are adapting faster than expected, the agent said. Ava's gaze remained steady. Then we adapt faster, she replied without hesitation, her calm unwavering, her presence anchoring the entire operation. And in that moment it became clear that this was not just about control. It was about anticipation, about seeing the move before it happened, about staying 3 steps ahead of something no one else could even see. Daniel took a slow breath, the realization settling fully. Now, he had not just interrupted a moment. He had stepped into a battlefield he could not perceive, one where the lines were invisible and the stakes were far beyond anything he had ever dealt with. Ava turned slightly, her eyes scanning the horizon again, then back to the agents. "We finished this clean," she said quietly, and the weight of that statement carried through every movement that followed. Because this was no longer just unfolding, it was being directed, controlled, resolved, and Daniel Brooks, standing just outside the center of it all, understood that whatever happened next would not be decided by him, but by the woman he had completely misjudged from the very beginning. For a moment it felt like everything was under control, like the system had absorbed the disruption and adjusted, every agent moving with quiet precision, every command executed without hesitation, and Ava Carter standing at the center of it all with the same calm authority that had reshaped the entire scene. But control in moments like this was never permanent. It was earned second by second, and somewhere beyond what they could see. Something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. One of the agents looked up from his device, his expression tightening just slightly. "We are losing one of the trace points," he said, not loud, but enough to cut through the rhythm that had settled over the operation. Ava did not react immediately. She watched the data for one more second, letting the pattern reveal itself. Then she spoke. "That is not a loss," she said quietly. "That is a redirection." And the distinction mattered, because it changed the response from recovery to anticipation. The agents adjusted instantly, rerouting their focus, recalibrating their approach. But the tension returned, sharper this time, because now it was clear whatever they were tracking was not just reacting, it was thinking, adapting, staying just out of reach. Daniel Brooks felt it too. Even without understanding the details, the shift in energy, the way the silence became heavier, more focused, like everyone was holding the same thought without saying it out loud. This was not over. Ava stepped forward slightly, her gaze fixed on the device, then beyond it, as if she could see the pattern extending past the screen. "They want us to follow," she said, her voice steady, analytical. "So we do not." Another agent responded quickly. "Then we hold position." Ava shook her head once, small but decisive. "No, we control the position." And with that the direction changed again, not defensive, not reactive, but deliberate, strategic. The agents moved with renewed clarity, narrowing their actions, limiting exposure, focusing only on what mattered. Daniel watched it unfold, the precision, the discipline, the complete absence of hesitation, and it became impossible to ignore. This was not chaos. This was control at a level he had never witnessed. A sudden flash of light reflected across the wet pavement as one of the vehicles adjusted its position, creating a tighter perimeter, subtle, but intentional. Ava lifted her head, scanning the horizon one more time, and then she spoke again, quieter now, but with a weight that carried through everything. "We are close." And those 3 words shifted the entire atmosphere, because they implied an end, not of the situation, but of the distance between cause and consequence. The agent beside her nodded, his voice lower now, more focused. "Then we lock it in." Ava's eyes remained steady, her expression unchanged, but there was something final in her presence now, something that signaled the operation was no longer unfolding. It was reaching its conclusion. Daniel Brooks stood there, no longer trying to intervene, no longer trying to understand every detail, because the truth had already settled in. He was not part of this. He had never been part of this. And whatever outcome was coming next had been set into motion long before he ever turned on those lights. And as the rain continued to fall, steady and indifferent, the last illusion of control he had held on to disappeared completely, replaced by a single realization. This moment was never his to command, only to witness. The shift came without warning, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, like a line being drawn that no one could see, yet everyone could feel. Ava Carter lowered her gaze to the device one final time, her eyes scanning the last sequence of data as it settled into place. And then she stopped, not because there was nothing left to read, but because there was nothing left to wait for. "It is done," she said quietly. And those 3 words carried more weight than everything that had come before. Because they did not signal an action, they confirmed a result. The agents around her reacted immediately, but not with urgency. With closure, devices lowered, positions eased, the invisible tension that had held the scene together beginning to dissolve, not into chaos, but into resolution, controlled, precise, complete. One of the agents spoke into his communication line, his voice steady. Target contained, no further activity detected. And somewhere beyond that highway, beyond the rain and the flashing lights, systems shut down, access points closed. A chain of events ending as quietly as it had begun. Daniel Brooks felt it. The difference. The way the air itself seemed to release something it had been holding. And for the first time since this moment began, there was nothing building, nothing approaching, nothing left to anticipate. Ava handed the device back without hesitation, her role in that part of the operation already complete, her posture unchanged, her expression as calm as it had been when he first approached her car. But now there was no ambiguity left, no uncertainty, only clarity. She had not been reacting to the situation. She had been guiding it from the moment it began. Daniel shifted slightly, his mind catching up in fragments, pieces of understanding forming too late to matter. "What was it?" he asked, his voice quieter now, not demanding, not challenging, just trying to grasp something that was already beyond him. The man with the badge glanced at him briefly, then back toward Ava, as if the answer did not belong to him to give. Ava met Daniel's gaze, and for a moment the world narrowed to that single exchange. No rain, no lights, no agents, just a quiet understanding passing between 2 people standing on completely different sides of the same moment. "Something that never reaches the headlines," she said calmly, her voice steady, "and something that cannot afford mistakes." The words settled in, not as an explanation, but as a boundary, a line between what could be known and what would remain unseen. Daniel nodded slowly, not because he fully understood, but because he finally accepted that he did not need to. Around them the vehicles remained, but their presence no longer felt like pressure. It felt like completion, like a system resetting after fulfilling its purpose. Ava turned slightly, her attention already moving forward, beyond this moment, beyond this place, as if the next decision was already waiting. And for the first time since the night began, Daniel Brooks did not try to stop it, did not try to question it, because standing there on that rain-soaked highway, watching a reality unfold that he had never been meant to see, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. Control is not always visible, and the most powerful decisions are often the ones that happen without anyone ever knowing they occurred. The silence that followed was not empty. It was deliberate, like the kind that comes after something important has already been decided. Ava Carter stood still for a moment longer, her gaze no longer fixed on Daniel Brooks, but on the horizon beyond him, as if her attention had already moved to something else waiting just out of view. The agents around her began to shift again, not with urgency, but with purpose. Their movements signaling transition rather than tension. One by one devices were secured, communications softened. The perimeter that had once felt tight and controlled now began to open, not in disorder, but in quiet completion. Daniel remained where he was, the rain still falling against his uniform. But now it felt colder, heavier, not because of the weather, but because of the understanding settling in. He had spent years believing that authority was something you carried, something visible, something enforced, but what he had just witnessed did not fit that idea. It did not need to be seen to be real. It did not need to be loud to be absolute. Ava took a slow step forward, her shoes meeting the wet pavement with the same measured calm she had shown from the beginning. And as she moved, the space around her adjusted naturally, not because anyone told it to, but because it recognized her place within it. One of the agents approached Daniel briefly, his expression neutral, professional. "Officer Brooks," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "you will be contacted regarding this incident." There was no accusation in his voice, no raised tension, just a statement of process, of what would follow, and somehow that made it feel even more final. Daniel nodded once, the motion small, restrained, as if anything more would not belong in this moment. Ava paused as she passed him, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge his presence, and for a brief second their eyes met again. But this time there was no tension, no imbalance, just clarity. "Next time," she said quietly, her voice steady. "Look twice before you decide who someone is." And the words did not carry anger. They carried truth, the kind that stays long after the moment ends. Daniel did not respond, not because he could not, but because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already happened. Around them the vehicles began to move, engines starting in quiet sequence, headlights shifting as they prepared to leave, the scene dissolving as smoothly as it had formed. Ava continued forward, stepping into one of the vehicles without hesitation, the door closing softly behind her, sealing the moment away. Daniel stood there as the last of the vehicles pulled out onto the highway, their presence fading into the distance. The flashing lights replaced once again by the steady rhythm of passing traffic. And just like that, it was over. No reports written in front of him, no explanations handed to him, just the echo of something far larger than he had understood, something that had unfolded right in front of him without asking for his permission. And as the rain continued to fall over the empty stretch of road, Daniel Brooks realized that the authority he had trusted for so long was not as absolute as he once believed, and that sometimes the people you think you understand the least are the ones who understand everything about you. The highway slowly returned to what it had always been, just another stretch of road under a gray sky, rain falling in steady lines, headlights passing by without hesitation, as if nothing had ever happened there. But for Daniel Brooks, nothing felt the same. He remained standing beside his cruiser, the engine still running, the radio still silent, the world around him moving forward, while something inside him stayed fixed in that moment that had already ended. He looked down at his hands again, then at the empty road ahead, replaying it not as it happened, but as he understood it now. Every word, every pause, every look Ava Carter had given him carried a weight he had missed at the time, not because it was hidden, but because he had never thought to look for it. The rain soaked through his uniform, but he did not move, not yet, because leaving meant accepting that it was over, and part of him was still trying to understand how something so controlled, so precise, could appear and disappear without leaving anything behind except a shift he could not ignore. His radio finally crackled back to life, the familiar voice of dispatch cutting through the silence. "Unit 12, status check." The normalcy of it felt distant, almost disconnected from what had just happened. Daniel pressed the button slowly, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "Unit 12, back in service." The words felt automatic, routine, but they did not carry the same certainty they once had, because now he knew that being back in service did not mean being in control. He turned toward his car, the reflection of the flashing lights still faint on the wet pavement, and paused for a second before opening the door, his mind still holding on to the last thing Ava had said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as something far more difficult to ignore: truth, the kind that does not demand attention but changes the way you see everything once you hear it. He sat inside the cruiser, the door closing with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The interior felt smaller now, not physically, but in comparison to what he had just witnessed. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, the same position he had been in at the start of the night, but nothing about it felt the same. The road ahead stretched out, unchanged, but his understanding of it had shifted completely, because now he knew that not every stop was simple, not every situation was what it appeared to be. and not every person could be measured by the assumptions he had carried for years. He started to pull back onto the highway, the tires cutting through the water as the cruiser merged into the flow of traffic, and as he drove, the rain continued to fall, steady and indifferent, just like it had before, but now it felt like something else, not just weather, but a quiet reminder that the world does not slow down for realization. It moves forward, leaving you to catch up, and Daniel Brooks understood that this was not the end of what had happened. It was the beginning of something he could not yet define, a shift in how he saw the badge he wore, the authority he carried, and the people he thought he understood, because sometimes the lesson does not come from what you control, it comes from what you never saw coming. Days passed, but the moment never really left him. It followed Daniel Brooks in the quiet spaces between calls, in the reflection of his badge against the windshield, in the silence that came after routine stops that no longer felt routine. The world looked the same on the surface, the same roads, the same radio chatter, the same rhythm of patrol, but something beneath it had shifted, something he could not ignore anymore. He found himself pausing more often, watching longer, listening differently, not because he was told to, but because he understood now that what you see is not always what is there, and what is there does not always announce itself. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the asphalt, Daniel sat in his parked cruiser, engine idling, watching the traffic pass by in steady lines, and for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about control. He was thinking about awareness, about the space between assumption and truth, about the cost of getting it wrong. His radio crackled again. Another call, another stop, another moment waiting to unfold. But this time he did not rush. He did not let instinct take over without question. He took a breath, a small one, but enough to create distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. Somewhere across the city, far beyond his reach, Ava Carter moved through another operation, another unseen moment shaping outcomes that would never be known to the people they protected. Her world continued forward without pause, precise, controlled, silent, and yet connected in ways most would never understand. The two paths did not cross again. They did not need to, because the impact had already been made, not through confrontation, not through force, but through realization. And that realization carried further than any report or reprimand ever could. Back on the road, Daniel turned on his signal and pulled forward, merging into the flow of traffic with a steadiness that felt different, not weaker, but more aware, more deliberate. The badge on his chest had not changed, but the meaning behind it had, because now he understood that authority is not proven by how quickly you act, but by how carefully you choose to see. And as the city lights began to flicker on, one by one, illuminating the streets in quiet patterns, a final thought settled in, simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. He thought he was enforcing the law, but that night, he learned that the law does not always wear a uniform, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the power.